What's going on, everybody? Good morning, good evening, or wherever you are, and whatever time it is, and welcome back to yet another video with you, man, Immersionaholic. And ladies and gentlemen, we have today another faction overview for the Divided Impera overhaul mod for Total War Rome 2. Today, we are checking out the Bosporan Kingdom, otherwise known as Arch Bosphorus, or Bosphorus, but today I'll just be referring to them as the Bosporan Kingdom. That's right, we are looking at one of the three factions that has recently received a massive overhaul to their roster and basically to the way that you play this faction. Arch Bosphorus, Massalia, and Cultus were the three major factions that got overhauled in the most recent 1.2.8 Divided Impera patch. So I'm really excited to get into this and let you all know the changes and exactly the roster of Arch Bosphorus, which is very different now. And it's possibly not as good as what you might expect, but we'll get into that a little bit later on. So first off, let's start off with the buffs and debuffs that the Bosporan Kingdom receives. So we share the following traits with Syracuse, Cultus, and Massalia. We have the Colonist Technology Tree. It's basically a minor overhaul of one of the military technology branches that allows you to get special population technologies that basically give you a boost to certain different tiers of your population. Some of these boosts are fairly minor, although they do stack up over time, and you do get some fairly significant increases in your population, which you will need quite dearly playing as the Bosporan Kingdom, because you're going to be in desperate need of maintaining your Greek, basically elite class population. So we'll talk more about that on the campaign map. We also share the Independence buff, which gives you plus 10% melee defense during battles in own or allied territory. Very nice little bonus there. However, just for the Bosporan Kingdom, we have Bosporian lands, which increases your agricultural income. Very helpful, although I wouldn't expect you to use an agriculture-based economy with Bosporan Kingdom. But, I mean, whatever works, works. And then we have the multiculturalism buff, which decreases foreign culture public order penalties, which is very helpful because you're surrounded by factions that do not share your culture, so you'll definitely need that. However, you have the Tyrant's debuff, which increases Empire maintenance, which is not good because Empire maintenance comes in severely strong in the late game usually for most factions. Once you get to that Empire level, that's where you're going to see that really cut into your income, so that's not good. But that is all for the buffs and debuffs. Now let's jump into the part 1 section of this video, where we'll check out the campaign for the Bosporan Kingdom. Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, here we are on the part 1 section of this video. So let's talk about the campaign situation. This is actually a really rare instance for a faction overview, because you start off with not only more than one city, you have all of the cities in a single province. Province of Bosporus. You have 3 cities and they are all inside of it. That is it though, you don't have any other cities outside, like on the fringes. But you control an entire province, which is not something a lot of factions can say. And even then, the ones that can say it are usually the ones that are really big already, and the factions that you expect to have that. For example, the Seleucid Empire, Carthage, I believe Bactria is as well, although its provinces are quite small, with only like 2 cities each. So this is really quite a rare instance. Not only that, but you actually have resources in 2 out of your 3 cities, which is really powerful. Fangoria over here to your east has wine, and then Tanais up here to the northeast has copper as well, so that's actually quite interesting. Both are actually really good resources to have, and you can start a trade economy with both of those resources pretty quickly, and you can even build industrial buildings for both chains to try and get your economy really rolling. We expand it right here, we can see we can do a copper mine for the copper, and then in Fangoria, or Fangoria, however you want to pronounce it, you can do a vintner, and then you expand it beyond that. Let's get rid of that though. So let's begin by talking about your diplomacy. And your diplomacy is basically non-existent. You have no relationships with anybody at all, no trade or non-aggression, nothing whatsoever. And you don't really have any neighbors that are all that friendly with you. However, you also don't have any neighbors that are all that aggressive with you. At least I didn't find them to be aggressive in my own testing, which is a few campaigns of this. So typically Syracuse or Syracuse to your east is hostile towards you, but they often get tangled up fighting other Scythian neighbors, such as the Royal Scythians to your north, or to the northeast they will fight some of their other Sarmatian neighbors that will be coming in. So even though they're hostile towards you, they're not a massive threat, at least not early on. Cultures down here to your southeast, although they're Caucasian, they do have some Hellenic influence, so if you expand that direction, you should get cities with some Hellenic culture, so that would be good for you. But they're fairly neutral to you and can be bought to be your ally. Pontus actually usually doesn't want to ally with you. I'm not sure why. You have the same culture. You're not neighbors, so you're not really going to be hostile towards each other. But for whatever reason, when I played as the Bosporan Kingdom, Pontus rarely wanted alliances with me, and I had to really earn alliances with them. The Royal Scythians, though, they will take an alliance and trade early on. You can't really trust them too much, so you're probably going to end up fighting them as your first enemy. But that's basically what's happening for your diplomacy. You have no ties to the old ancient Greek homeland down here where your people migrated from to come colonize up here on the northern Black Sea. So that's interesting, and I would fix that very quickly. I would get a fleet and just send it down here, down into Greece, and get some trade, get some diplomacy happening with your old Greek ancestors. It makes sense to me, and I don't think it's really abusing that kind of mechanic, how you can just sail a single fleet all the way around the map. And technically, as Bosporan Kingdom, you could have trade with the Iceni, which doesn't make a lot of sense realistically, but in terms of gameplay, you can do it if you like. Although I don't recommend that much, but it's up to you. Besides all that, you have only one army here in your capital with your general and 3 spare units, and then you have a spy as well. So that's it. Diplomacy, looking pretty basic. Your position, strong, but not all that overly complicated either. So before we talk about your economy, let's talk a little bit about strategy and what to do with all of this. Generally, my advice, if you want a fairly easy campaign, is to either go west or you go southeast. And why is that? Well, because one, the province to the north of you, Sarmatia, is right here. You have the capital, the walled settlement, about a turn away, maybe 2 turns away from your own capital. So you really do need to secure that quite early on, so that way your home province is fairly safe. Additionally, the other cities inside of Sarmatia are not that far away from each other. Not really. They're basically within this triangle right here. So that means that you can march to all of them fairly quickly and easily. However, going to the east, into the province of Scythia, you will notice that there is a massive difference in the number of cities and how far away they are. So just because we can see this one city, we can actually click on the names of each city and it will show us where they are. So let's do that really quickly. So Samandar, all the way over here, way over here on the coastline. Siracina is right here, or Siracina. The city of Ra is all the way up here. Look at that, look how far away that is. All that distance to get to another city. And then the capital of the region is all the way down here. Isn't that crazy? That is like probably the biggest province in the game, I would imagine. Like, look how far away that is. Oh my goodness, that's insane. But it's just not worth it. There isn't really all that much there for you to conquer. Not really a lot of resources. In fact, I don't think there's any at all, possibly. But regardless, it's so far spread apart that it really will take you a lot of time to just march to each settlement. And while you're marching to each settlement, the nomads have the entire advantage against you because they'll be using largely cav-based armies. So that is exactly how you do not want to fight the nomads and Scythians. Instead, you'll be wanting to fight them inside of their cities because they will be very constricted, their cavalry cannot be used effectively, and your infantry is better than theirs in every single way. So you need to use that as much as you can. So generally my advice, expand west or straight southeast and take on the Caucasians, Armenians, and go into Anatolia. Going west is probably the better option because you just keep encountering barbarians for a little bit. Get down through the Odrysians, you get some amazing AOR units and mercenaries. And then you can conquer Greece and the Greek city-states in Anatolia, which would be super useful because they all have good population ready for you to use and abuse. So very quickly, let's talk about your economy. Early on, like I said, you have 2 major resources. You have copper and you have wine. instantly that kind of indicates what kind of economy you're going to aim for early on, which is of course going to be a trade focused economy. Your capital is literally on the ocean. It is a perfect city for you to actually start receiving trade with other factions, especially those far away. It's absolutely ideal. The only main thing you need to worry about is making sure you do not get blockaded, because if you get blockaded here, all of the trade that comes in from the ocean gets stopped, and that can absolutely destroy your economy. I've seen it happen before. It's pretty rare for the AI to do it that well, but they can do it, especially if you neglect having a navy at all. And in multiplayer campaigns as well, you'll see this happen. So be very careful not to lose your capital, and don't let it get blockaded. Otherwise, you'll really get smacked by your economy, taking such heavy losses early on. Besides that, though, you're a Greek faction, basically, and because of that, trade is going to be your number one kind of way of earning money. Besides that, you could do a heavy industry-focused economy if you like, especially using these resources. And especially if you go west, you have even more resources as you continue going, especially down in Thrace, where you can get slaves down here, which is one of the best resources in the game. So that could be very useful for you. And then you have, of course, more resources in Greece and Anatolia. So basically, you're pushed towards having a commerce-based economy, so you should try to focus on that, in my opinion. Although you do have that bonus that increases your agricultural income. So if you don't want to try to be friendly with others and get a trade empire instead, you could focus on agriculture, try to use that bonus to make sure you get that extra money. But basically, the bottom line is that you have options for your economy. Alrighty, so next up we need to talk about your population. Well, this is going to be a little bit of a mixed bag, because obviously you are one of the Greek colonial factions. So you have the system in place where you can build different types of barracks. You can build a Hellenic outpost, or you can build the nomadic outpost. In fact, you can build both. You can even build both in the exact same city if you like. You still have to suffer through the negatives of both outposts. However, it's up to you if you think it's a big deal or not. But the bottom line is that you will be needing to consider your population and what type of unit you want to recruit. For example, if you want to use a Greek-focused army, you will build the Hellenic outpost, of course, so you get more Hellenic-focused units. However, if you want to use those Greek units, then you need to really focus on taking Greek cities, because early on, the majority of your Greek units come from the Kotoikoi social class, either that or the Eugenie social class for your like really elite units. And the Kotoikoi, they are only at 3,000 in your core city, which is your largest city. 3,000 men is not really a lot. That's enough for maybe one army, and even then, if you recruited all of those men into a single Greek army, any losses you take are going to be hard to replace, and it will hurt your core city economically to drain all of your tier 2 units so quickly. So instead, what I would recommend is that you draft your Greek units from all of your cities. So you have your one faction right here, right? So do we have any Kotoikoi units? Yeah, right here. Your Thracian units also come from the Kotoikoi social class. Not all of them, but most of them do. So that's going to be a problem for you as well. But say if you want to use them, I'll recruit a few here. And then after I recruited a few, I would send my army over here to Fangoria. And then this has 30,000 or just under 30,000 men as well. And it actually has 3,600 Kotoikoi men available on turn 1. And then we go up to Tanais. And up here, we see that there's 2,200. So I'd probably take like around 1,000 men from each city if you really wanted to have a Greek-focused army. And then you could use all the Greek units you like for that one army. But your second army, it can't really copy that because you've already drained the majority of your Greek population. So instead, what you need to do is focus your armies on being almost horde-like by using and abusing the Scythian population. The Scythians usually come from the Lao or Laoi, we'll go Lao, social class, which is your tier 3 social class. And in your capital on turn 1, you have 16,000 of them available, ready to come and fight and die for you. That sounds like a lot, and it is a lot, don't get me wrong. However, the majority of your Scythian units are not all that elite or all that good. And so early on, as you're fighting other Scythians, especially like coming up here taking on the Royal Scythians, you will notice that you will take pretty severe losses with your Scythian units just based on the archer fire that they'll be taking. Plus, you won't really have an advantage over the enemy army, other than it's probably being played by the AI if you're doing single player. Besides that, though, using the Lao social class means that you're going to have large armies that will be heavily focused on your first and maybe second wave of units being really, really low tier units. You can get some decent sifting units, don't get me wrong. Once your barracks increases and all that, you will get good units. It will take you a while to get your elite tier units as well, so it'll be quite a while before you even begin benefiting from having those really good sifting units. It'll be a fair while at least, although you can kind of total up and just wait for them to come. But generally speaking, your population means that you will have to really consider what type of unit you want to use, what kind of army you're going to have, and then you need to plan ahead accordingly. This is not a faction where you can just look at your roster and be like, oh, look at this hoplite unit, it looks really sick, I want to have 10 of those as my main battle line. That's not going to happen. 200 men times 10 units, that's 2,000 men that you're draining into a single army, all because you want a hoplite wall. I mean, it's a cool idea, and I myself like units being uniform, but 2,000 men means that this city loses a massive chunk of its tier 2 population. In fact, it loses almost all of it. That's pretty insane. And you really can't be affording to do that and throw away your manpower, especially against the other kind of low tier factions like the Scythians. Their units are not all that amazing. They have fantastic cavalry, but their infantry are pretty weak. So there's no point in using your elite tier units against them when you don't need to. Just use your sifting units, use and abuse them, like I said, and then your population will hopefully be stable enough to where you can pick and choose what kind of army you want. Additionally, as you begin marching south, way down here, and you start taking all these Greek cities in Anatolia and in Greece itself, you will also be able to recruit more Greek units. So you will notice that as you expand. But this is going to be an issue throughout your entire campaign. You will constantly have to consider what kind of units do you want. Are you going to use the foreigner AOR mercenary units that you come across? Are you going to focus on trying to use your Scythians as your main battle line? Or are you going to be the kind of elitist Greek style player and only use Greek units and really have small armies and not all that many of them as well? So you have a bit of a decision to make regarding your population, and while it's not as serious as, say, like Sparta, and their severely limited options regarding population, you still will have to consider it. A little bit more than normal is what I would say. So that's basically it for the campaign. There is one more thing I would like to mention, and that is your king, your Basileus, is 40 years old on turn 1 of the game start. And so if you're playing on 4 turns per year DEI, which is standard, he's going to get old very quickly, and the older he gets, the less likely it is he will have children. So get him married as quickly as you can. Maybe even consider adopting another noble into his party, into the Spartakid dynasty especially. But politics in Rome 2 isn't really all that impactful. It can cause you issues, so I would try to get on top of it if you can. But if he does die, it's not going to be the end of the world. You will get another noble that will take his place. But I thought it was worth mentioning anyway. I guess I can briefly talk about the outposts that you get for the Bosporan Kingdom. It's basically the same as Massalia, so if you've seen the Massalian overview, you won't really see too much difference here. The Hellenic outpost basically provides you with Greek and Thracian units. That's right, you also get Thracian units. You get Thracian footmen, Thracian javelinmen, and then as time goes on, you will also get better peltists, and you get the Rom Fire Warriors. Now this is a very big deal because they are one of the best units in the game in terms of being a shock infantry unit. So that's super helpful for you. You may want to consider going down the Greek tree just to use those. But that is what the Hellenic outpost will provide. It also has a debuff to your food. It takes away -1, although the nomadic one does as well. But then you also get increased banditry with your Hellenic outpost, plus you have a diplomatic negative bonus with nomadic factions. However, you then get +1 Hellenic cultural influence and +5% wealth from all commerce, and you get a 0.3% increase in your first and second class social class. And all of these basically increase with each tier of building that you have for this outpost. I won't go through every single one, it's not necessary. But the main thing to understand is that you'll basically be supporting your Greek population with this, and because of that, these Scythian cultures that live around you will not like that at all, and you'll have to suffer some banditry unrest and diplomatic penalties because of it. One minor thing to note though is that the level 3 and level 4 for this building chain require you have the copper resource. You do have it on turn 1, so it shouldn't be a big deal, but this is required, I believe, for all of the colonial factions. So that's Bosporus, Massalia, and Colchis, I believe, has that requirement as well. Plus, you also need to get the Hellenization technology, which, if we have a look really quickly, where is it at? Here it is. So you can have that pretty quickly, though. It's not a big deal, but it's just worth pointing out. So if you go down the nomadic outpost tree, though, this is where you'll obviously get your nomad units from. So your tier 1 level is going to be some very low tier units focusing heavily on cavalry, skirmishing, and some very light spearmen that are pretty much not really all that useful at all. Tier 2, you'll see some better cavalry and some very good archers, plus you start getting axemen. These Scythian axemen will be very useful for you. Although note, they are nowhere near as good as the Rumfire warriors that you could access, so you might want to prioritize getting those guys instead. And then tier 3, we start getting better axemen that are more armed and just have higher skill, higher stats across the board. You also have some spearmen that you'll be getting access to. And then in the final tier, you'll get some very good cataphract style horse archers that are obviously Scythian as well. So that would be really good for you to have. But you don't get the Hellenic units. So basically the Scythians provide you with excellent cavalry and some axemen, whereas the Greek tree focuses more so on infantry, having very good infantry. Plus, you still get some very good cavalry as well. So either way, you won't miss out on cav, although the horse archers that the Scythians provide are probably better than your low tier cavalry that you get access to, so you might want to use them. Additionally though, you also need to consider that you get access to a lot of AOR units. AOR units can be identified by these little symbols you see in the bottom left corner of the unit card, that little black banner right there. You get access to Thracian warriors, Scythian hoplites, which is very interesting, although they're not too good, but their armor is 35, so that's actually impressive. And then you get Scythian horse archers as well, and there's a bunch of other AOR units, some javelin men. Is there a tier 4 unit? No tier 4. Just 1, 2, and 3. Okay, in tier 1 you get some other units as well. So you do have some pretty interesting AOR units available. You even have some decent mercenaries on turn 1, although you need to wait a while for the better ones to refill. But that is basically all you need to know about your units, on the campaign map at least, and your colonial building chains that you now have access to. And very quickly, I will just state that you can access your population technology by going to the management tree, and then it will be each category has 1 or 2 different things that increase your population. For example, your tier 1 under management has the military settlement technology, which gives you plus 0.5 to your second class population. Then you jump up to the next tier where you'll see, where is it? Right here. Your mercenaries technology increases your third and fourth class population. And then you also have a bunch more here. Yeah, we have 2 more technologies, the supply reforms and the remuneration reforms, which increase your population growth. So that's all that is. I won't go into details about it, as I already have when I covered the update for the 1.2.8 patch. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that's basically it for the campaign situation for the Bosporan Kingdom. I already gave my advice, so I won't give you too much more in the verdict section. But now, let's jump into the military overview for the Bosporan Kingdom. Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, here we are at the part 2 section of this video. We'll check out the military of the Bosporan Kingdom, and here we are with one of your 3 General's Bodyguard units that you get access to, and this is your Royal Cavalry. Your Bosporan Royal Cavalry are a very powerful unit, probably one of your best shock cavalry units you get access to, if not actually the best. Your biggest downfall with them though is that they only have a melee defense of 6, so that's really low. However, their attack is massive at 15, charge bonus of 60, and armor of 51. These guys will compete against some of the best in the East, although the Eastern factions will still outclass even this high tier elite unit. So be wary of that. So when you do finally get access to it, it isn't available straight away. There's another cav unit you get access to first. Then try to use this as much as you can, because it's a very powerful unit. It will be expensive, but it's very powerful and thus worth using in my own opinion. But anyway, that is it for your general. Now let's talk about your skirmishers, and as you can see, we have a fairly decently sized roster to talk about, so as always, I will try to skip over the unimportant units. Speaking of which, we have your Thracian Javelin Men right here. Nothing too substantial about them, except they do have a decent melee attack of 9, but their defense is at the most pathetic defense I think I've ever seen, which is a defense of just 2. That's really, really low, and they have no armor, so I would be really hesitant to send them even into a rear charge in battle, because after just a minute or 2, they will start dying quite quickly once the enemy units turn around and engage them. So be careful about using them. No special abilities, but they do have good armor damage, good weapon damage, and armor piercing. Armor piercing is at 7, and the weapon damage is at 21, so that's decent, but man, that melee defense is so friggin' low, I don't know if I'd even want to recharge them. We then have Scythian Skirmishers. They do not have the melee abilities of the Thracian Javelin Men, so definitely do not use those guys in melee combat. Besides that, nothing else to say about them. However, we then get to your Thracian Peltas, and this is where we start seeing really proper Peltas style units. Not only are they very good at skirmishing, but these guys, because they're Thracian, they do have that very high weapon damage for a total of 30 weapon damage, melee attack of 11, defense of 9. These guys are specialists. Their only issue really is having only 175 men and then only having an armor of 15, which is definitely going to let them suffer a little bit because of that. But as long as you use them appropriately, recharge them into an enemy, use all of their javelins first, they will get you some very nice kills against heavily armored units. But that's it for your Javelin Men. Then we have your Scythian Foot Archers, very, very low tier archer. Almost nothing to say about that, except they also have an insanely high weapon damage, an armor piercing damage of 12 and a weapon damage of 16. Charge bonus 24, but their melee attack is only at 5. Again, very, very low. That weapon damage is nice, but it's almost, again, not worth charging them in with such a low melee attack. Yeah, I don't think I would want to charge them in, but anyway, that's just my recommendation. However, we then have the Scythian Armored Archers. These guys are very, very high tier. One of the best archers in the game you get access to. Just wow, very impressive. Very high range at 185, damage of 18, like missile damage it is. But they have decent melee capabilities. Melee attack of 7 is pretty poor, but again, we're seeing that high weapon damage. Armor piercing of 13, weapon damage of 18. Very impressive. Armor 25, charge bonus 26. These guys are quite impressive. Their only real suffering is in their melee attack and defense of being only 7 each. But with experience, that will increase. So if you get yourself some experienced archers, which is pretty easy to do, as long as they keep doing well, then they will do very well in a melee engagement. And they have shields on their backs, which does help protect them from enemy archer fire. It even helps protect them from fire coming at them from the front. I have no idea why that is, but it is what it is. So just passing on information to you guys. Yeah, weird mechanic, but it is what it is. That's it for your skirmishers. You'll notice one thing missing: no slingers. There is literally no slingers at all for you. You might be able to get them from Cultists once you take over Cultists. They have some good long-range slingers. But yeah, besides that, long-range skirmishing is not your forte. At least not super long-range, but you do have good archers. So it's not all terrible news. Now we'll move on to your spearmen and then your swordsmen after that. Okay, so checking out your first unit of spearmen, 300 men strong. They're basically a levy unit, although slightly above. They do have some decent stats, especially the melee defense of 15. But that armor of 20 is actually quite impressive considering how many men are in this, and that it's basically probably one of your most bottom tier units you get access to. So that's actually not bad at all. You might want to use these guys to try and plug a hole in your main battle line, or basically receive a charge from an enemy. Because of their high melee defense, it will take a while for the enemy to kill them, and they can wear down the enemy before you sending in really good units. But besides that, nothing really worth saying about them. But then we go on to your Scythian Spearmen. Statistically, the Scythian Spearmen are better in almost every single way, except for one major one, which is armor. They have no armor, whereas the Bosporan Spearmen we just checked out have an armor of 20, so that's quite significant. Whereas Scythian Spearmen, no armor at all. Melee defense of 16 though. The rest of their stats are kind of decent, but again, this is one of your most bottom tier levy style units. And in fact, I would argue actually that the past unit that we just checked out wouldn't be a levy unit, but statistically, it's not really all that much better than some levy spearman units you do get. So that's why I say what I say. Although it is basically like a Therios spear unit, I guess. So it is definitely useful. It has its uses. Don't take my criticism too harshly towards that unit. The Scythian Spearman, though, take that criticism all the way. Very poor. Try not to use that if you can afford it. However, from these loose Spearman units, we then jump up to your hoplites. First up, we have the Levy Hoplites, which are, of course, a low-tier Levy Hoplite unit for you. However, they are not a light hoplite unit, and what I mean by that is that they have the phalanx ability. Light hoplites do not get the phalanx ability. So even though they're not very well armored at only 15, defense is only at 12, attack only 6, they do have the phalanx ability, which helps them out massively, and their morale will be higher than that of the Levy tier units. But yeah, besides that phalanx ability, there isn't really too much else that's impressive about these guys. Very low tier. We then jump up to your Bosporan hoplite. So these guys are actually very strong. A very good armor of 35, phalanx ability of course. Melee attack is only at 7, but the defense is at 15. And they even have a little bit of armor penetration at 4, which is kind of interesting, but not really all that much of a difference maker. And they have, of course, benefits against elephants and cavalry of 10 each. So these guys are very good. Nice main frontline unit for you if you can afford the population for them. But after that, we then jump up to the Bosporan Royal Guard. This is one of your general's bodyguard units. Very high tier hoplite unit. Do you want to use very high tier hoplites? That's up to you. To be honest, I don't really recommend using generals as infantry unless they're going to be governors and only fighting in city battles. So that's the only reason I'd recommend you use this over your cav generals. Besides it though, it's still a great hoplite unit, but it is what it is. It's a hoplite unit. It will still get beaten by pikemen going up against it from the front. So you do need to be wary of that. Speed of only 2 as well, so it won't be like it's going to be outflanking the enemy very quickly or anything either. So good unit, but does it have much use in a grand campaign? That's up to you basically. Then after that, we have the Bosporan Heavy Spearmen. Now these guys are very powerful. They're basically like a thorax spearman unit for you. Very interesting armor. Although interesting that it's basically like a grey kind of color happening for all the units. But anyway, these guys are very, very powerful. They have a very good statistics. Attack of 8, not very good, but they have a melee defense of 20. That is massive. That is insane. And if we hover over it, their shield value is at 8. Which is very high. So these guys will be heavily protected from projectiles. They have an armor of 41 as well. So even if they do get hit, it's going to take a lot of hitting to take them down. Their biggest flaw, in my opinion, though, is that they have no special abilities. They don't have the shield wall style ability, which I believe is called discipline formation. And they don't have the phalanx ability either. So they will suffer because of that. But they're still a fantastic unit. Very cool Scythian bloke here at the front. But overall, it's a fantastic unit. It looks very cool. But that lack of phalanx ability might hamper it in like a frontal assault. You might want to be a little bit careful about what you send it up against. From fire warriors will trash it eventually. But that is a specialty. So be careful when you go into Thrace. But that's it for your spearmen. You have a couple loose spearmen units. Basically like the Furio style unit right here. You then have a Levy unit. Then you have your Thorax style spearmen. But besides that, you only have hoplites. So in case you haven't figured it out, the number one thing you are missing is pikemen. You have 0 pikemen in your roster. Of course, as always, they're accessible through mercenaries and AOR units, but you have to get to those regions to find them and recruit them. And that won't be for a while. So my main concern is that when you do finally go up against those factions that do have pikemen as their main frontline unit, all of these units will get trashed by pikemen. So you can't rely on hoplite walls to hold against pikemen. You can maybe try to use it to like stay at a distance and stop the pikes from moving forward. But if the pikemen actually engage your hoplites and start attacking them, that's when you're going to start taking very heavy losses, especially against the high tier pikes of like the Seleucus or something, which you'll almost certainly be fighting at one point or another, so be careful of that. But barbarians, though, should be easily dealt with these units, but like I said, run fire wars and shock infantry will carve them up. Let's talk about your swordsmen very quickly, though. So for your swordsmen, we start off with axemen. I know, but you know what I mean when I say let's start off with your swordsmen. It's basically, let's start off with your melee troops that are not spearmen. So you have Scythian axemen here. They're available to you very early on. Very low tier unit, no armor at all. Melee attack and defense is only at 7. Their weapon damage is quite good at 18, combined with a melee armor piercing damage of 13, which is pretty strong, especially for a low tier unit. But they are just that. They are a low tier unit. They'll die very easily. Only use them for rear charges if you can do so. Beyond that, though, we then have the Thracian footmen. Now, the Thracian footmen still do have some armor piercing damage, but not as much because they aren't all using the axes that the axeman unit is. So they have a total weapon damage of 28, melee attack of 9, defense of 8. So that's not too bad, but then they're really let down by their armor, which is only at 8, which is really low. But then they kind of make up for it in their massive numbers at 300 men per unit, which is actually not bad at all. So not a bad unit, but it also has its major letdowns, but it can still be fairly useful early on in your campaign. Then we jump up to your Scythian medium axemen. These guys come from the tier 2, I believe, of the the Scythian outposts that you can build. Now these guys, they're basically an upgrade of the previous axeman unit in every single way. They even have an armor of 20, so it's a little bit more substantial. Their weapon damage is very high at weapon damage of 19 and armor piercing of 14, which is massive. That's getting you to a total weapon damage of 33, which is very significant. I would still try to get them into rear charges, but they can handle frontal assaults as well, depending on what kind of unit they're going up against. But very cool unit, very diverse looking unit as well. That's one of the cool things about this roster overhaul. For all 3 of the factions that did get overhauled, the Greek colonial factions that did, the majority of the units now have a lot of variety in how they actually look. So there's a bit of a Hellenic influence and, of course, some Scythian and barbarian style influence as well. And you see that a lot with that Axeman unit. But anyway, besides them, we then jump up all the way to your best shock infantry you get access to, which is the Thracian Rumfire Warriors. It's almost a little bit OP that you get access to the Rumfires. I would personally prefer, if the DEI team didn't want to remove it, I would at least prefer that they limit how many you can get access to. Severely limited to like 4 units total, probably. But anyway, that's just my personal input. But the unit itself is friggin' insane. A total weapon damage of 36, charge bonus of 11, melee attack of 15. However, they do only have an armor of 10 and a melee defense of 6. So obviously they are attack, attack, attack. They do not defend very well whatsoever. And if you do need them to defend something, have them defend it by attacking. That's basically how you use these guys. Especially on a rear charge into some heavily armored legionnaires. They will dominate and get a lot of kills very, very quickly. Very cool looking unit. I love the style of their weapons as well. Looks pretty badass. But yeah, very, very powerful unit. You can use that against any of the really good armored factions like the Greeks and the Romans, and who all focus heavily on using heavily armored infantry. And then we have your last infantry unit to discuss, which is your Bosporan infantry. These guys are basically Roman legionnaire copycats. They are not as good, but they're still fairly decent. Melee attack of 14, defense of 10, total weapon damage of just 26, almost no charge bonus at only 16, which is really low. Armor of 35 though. However, they do not have any special abilities, no defensive formations at all, so that does hurt them a little bit in terms of their use. So yeah, it's basically up to you how you want to use these guys. As a main battle line unit, they wouldn't be too bad, but they're also not all that great either. I might prefer to use a hoplite main battle line, or rely on my axemen to deliver some serious shock damage, whereas these guys, they don't really specialize in all that much, but that means that they're also versatile. So it's up to you how you want to use them, and if you do, it's a pretty helpful unit, but I don't know. It's I can definitely see them getting beaten down fairly easily by say like pike heavy factions. These guys have like no advantage against them except they can run away, and they have one javelin, so that single javelin will help. Will it win them an engagement every time though? No, it won't. So just be careful how you use those guys. Swordsmen that don't really have a lot of benefits for them can be overpowered fairly easily when they go up against units like the hoplites, like the heavy hoplites that you will face against the Greek colonies, or against the Diadochi pikemen, and Roman legionaries, of course, will beat them any day of the week. But now that's it for your infantry, so let's go into your cavalry and then on to the verdict shortly after. Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for us to check out our cavalry. You might notice my voice sounds a little bit different. I've actually had to record this section and the verdict at a different time compared to when I recorded the rest of the overview, so apologies for that. But anyway, let's get into our cavalry and then we'll talk about the verdict. So first up, we have our skirmisher dedicated cavalry. I've separated our cav into two groups. This group is our skirmisher cav, and then this group is pure melee cavalry. So as you can see, you have quite a few options in the skirmisher cav department. First off, we start off with your only javelin cav unit that you have, which is the Scythian Young Horseman unit. Now this unit doesn't have the best stats. It's pretty low tier overall, only 13 armor. However, it is very fast with a good speed of 8. But the big thing about it, if you look over here, boom, is that they have guerrilla deployment, plus they also have the stalk ability, one of the most powerful abilities in the game any unit can have, probably the single most powerful, and this unit has it. Although I believe it is the only cavalry unit that you have that does use it. We'll have to double check as we go through. No, I don't think we even need to double check. Pretty sure this is your only unit, so that's very, very useful. Makes this unit 10 times more powerful. Recommend you use this unit against other players at the very least. And it could be good against the AI when you want to get close to their archers without them seeing your cavalry, so that might be a good time to use it. Looking pretty badass. I mean, not only is this full of bros from the gym, but there's a lot of variety in the units, so that's fantastic. Looking really, really badass. Next up, we have the Scythian Light Horsemen. Nothing special to say about them. They're just your most bottom tier horse archer unit. All of your other units will be horse archers or melee from now on. That's your only javelin unit. Yeah, nothing really interesting to say about these guys. Just a very low tier archer unit. They do have 120 men though instead of just 100, so that is nice. But beyond that, nothing else to say. Then we have your Bosporan heavy archers. Now these guys go down to only having 100 men in their unit. And there is a difference between them and the Scythian light horsemen, being that one is Bosporan, so Greek, and the other is Scythian. So the Scythian light horsemen, I can't say for sure, but I believe they come from your third tier population, whereas these guys should come from the second, the Katoikoi social class. I'm like 95% sure, just saying that off the top of my head. But anyway, the main thing is that there is a difference in their statistics as well as their overall unit composition, because this unit has only 100 men and the other 120. And this unit is just better entirely across the board, and they're still very fast with a speed of 8. But they have very good weapon damage, decent charge bonus of 38 for a skirmisher cav unit. Melee stats are pretty decent with an attack of 11. Defense is only at 6 though, so don't let them get stuck in a longer engagement. After that though, we then have the Scythian heavy horse archers. Comparing this to the last unit, this unit is far more based on shock, and there's a couple ways you can tell. First off, it has a very pathetic melee defense of only 4. However, the next way you can tell is that they have lances, whereas the previous units do not. So this unit, even though it's technically a horse archer unit in this category, it's actually more so a shock charging unit. They'll charge in with their lance. They'll have to swap to their swords in close combat, but that is where they will get wrecked, so don't let them do that. Pull them out before they have to use their swords and just keep using the lance over and over again. Very good early tier cav to get, but it will certainly get wrecked against the more high tier shock cavalry of the eastern faction. So be careful once you start expanding into Armenia and Persia. They will get demolished in a one-on-one against that, but against infantry, they're amazing. Very, very useful, and still an ammunition of 15. Next up, we have these Scythian noble horse archers. Comparing these to your Scythian heavy horse, these guys are very heavy with an armor of 49, so the speed has been lowered to compensate for that. Unfortunately, their range is only 160 though. It's not really going up all that much, only by 10. These guys have a melee defense of 6, but it's still quite low, so I wouldn't keep them in melee combat. It's interesting though, because it doesn't appear that these guys have a lance. And I'm guessing, why is their melee defense so low? I'm not too sure on why it is. It could be something to do with... Actually, you know what it would be? It's because they don't have a shield. So if we hover over melee defense, it says base value of 4, shield value of 2. What? Where is the shield? I don't see any shield, sir. Maybe 1 or 2 of them have a shield. Sometimes these units will have like only a few of their men inside the unit have a shield, and that's why their melee defense is so low. What? Okay. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is that this unit is really bad with its defense, so don't let it get stuck in a long engagement. It has very good armor piercing damage at 12 though. Ah, okay. Never mind, that's why it has lower melee defense. Ah, so you could have this unit engage with other units that are heavily armored, and it might do very well, but still, that melee defense, that's still gonna hurt them, man. I would be a little bit hesitant. It depends on the unit that they're engaging in. So just try to be wary of what unit you let this unit be engaged in for a long period of time. But their 49 armor is pretty massive. It should keep them alive for a while. But that melee defense of 6 means that they're going to get hit a lot. So you don't want them going up against armor piercing units, otherwise they will get demolished. Then we come to your Scythian Lancers, the last unit in our long line right here. If anything, actually, though, this should have been before the nobles, so apologies for that. But the reason I actually did put them at the end is because I was going to include them as only a melee cav unit, because they only have an ammunition of 5. These guys are not dedicated horse archers. They're basically a shock cavalry unit that's about mid to heavy, I would say high tier actually. A high tier shock cav unit that has archer capability with an ammunition of only 5. Its other stats are pretty decent. And once again, we do see that armor piercing damage coming in of 12, so I'm guessing they use axes once they get into combat or something like that. Although this dude has a sword, but anyway, doesn't matter. The point is that they have very good weapon damage. But of course, as always, their melee defense is very bad at 6, and their melee attack is only at 9, so these guys are really purely dedicated to the charge. You don't want them stuck in a long engagement at all, which is a story for most of your skirmisher cavalry. But anyway, that is all of your skirmisher cav. You can see that you have a Scythian influence for sure, which you should obviously, but you also have some Greek units, and the Greek units are typically better equipped with armor and whatnot. But you're really relying on your Scythian population, sorry. So do keep that in mind, and try to be aware of what unit gives you what population cost. So you might want to focus having more Scythian units than the heavy Greek units, because they come from your tier 3 social class. You need to double check that before you start recruiting entire horse archer armies. But anyway, let's talk about your melee cav. So first off, we have the Bosporan cavalry. The lowest tier of your melee cav, but it's not all that bad. Its main downfall is that it has only an armor of 18. But a defense of 11 and attack of 8, charge bonus 47. This unit is going to do fairly well in a long engagement against other low tier cavalry. So you could have them hunt down like low tier horse archers and they would beat them, or low tier shock cav. And so they should do fairly well in that kind of engagement, but there's only 100 men, as is the case for all of your melee units now. So be aware of that. But after that, we go to the Bosporan Lancers, back to the shock cavalry basically, and that's where we'll mainly be staying. Bosporus really relies on using shock cavalry, and that's definitely no exception with these units that we're about to look at. So I won't go into the stats about this unit. It's just a very good shock cavalry unit. However, it does not have the armor piercing damage of the other units, so do keep that in mind. You could still use it to recharge heavily armored units, but it might not do as well as the armor piercing units, so keep that in mind. We then have the late Bosporan Lancers, and comparing the two of them, the late Bosporan Lancers are much heavier with an armor of 45 and a lower speed of 6. But these guys actually do have armor piercing capabilities. Armor piercing at 12, weapon damage at 18. So when you get to the late Bosporan Lancers instead of just the standard ones, that's when you'll be wanting to use them for sure. Very nice. They're starting to look like Parthian Cataphract units. I remember using the Parthian Bodyguard in my Parthian campaign, and it looked very similar to this. So that's cool. A very badass unit. Definitely recommend using that. And then after that, we have the Bosporan Noble Cavalry. These guys are pretty solid. One of your highest tier shock cav that you get access to. However, again, we don't see that armor piercing damage continuing up, and their armor is at 41, so you do have more heavily armored units if you like. But man, that melee defense only at 5 is really, really going to hurt this unit. Only let them charge into units and then pull them out as soon as you can. Otherwise, they will get demolished. I also believe this is your other General's Bodyguard unit. Don't quote me on that, but I know you have 3 units. We already talked about 2, so that might be the 3rd one. I'm not entirely sure off the top of my head. But anyway, it doesn't matter, because that's your Bosporan Noble Cavalry, and while they're good, you have better shock cav units, so I don't know if I recommend using them all that much, unless it is as a General's Bodyguard. Then I would recommend it until you get to the Royal Bosporan Cavalry that we already talked about at the beginning of this section. But that unit, that unit is deadly. Anyway, let's talk about your last unit, which is the Scythian Noble Cavalry. Now, the Scythian Noble Cavalry absolutely have everything covered. They have a melee attack of 11, a melee defense of 10, a charge bonus of 62, and they carry armor-piercing weapons, and their AP is at 12, and their weapon damage is at 19, giving a total of 31 damage. That is massive. Very, very good. They even have a bonus versus infantry of 4, thus increasing their melee attack. And then they also have an armor of 49, base morale 49, speed of 7. These guys are the best of the best. You might have 1 or 2 units that have certain higher stats in 1 or 2 categories, but these units have the highest stats combined, with basically them being perfect across the board. The only thing that they don't have is long-range skirmishing capability, but it doesn't matter. These guys will absolutely trounce anything they come into contact with. However, you do need to be aware that the Eastern factions still have better units than this. Atropakan, Parthia, Bactria, possibly Bactria. But the Eastern Persian factions, they have better cav units than this. So if you charge this head on into that, they will lose over time. They'll still do fantastic, but they will lose. So watch out for that mainly in the late game. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that is it for your military roster. As you can see, you have a fair bit of units to choose from. You're going to be very reliant on cavalry, and your infantry is really lacking in long-range skirmishers, and you don't have pikemen, which is a massive blow to you since you are a Greek faction, and you'll be fighting Greek factions for a fair bit of your campaign. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, now let's go to the part 3 section of this video, where we'll talk about the verdict of the Bosporan Kingdom. Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, here we are at the verdict for this video. So there's a couple little points we need to get out of the way first before we actually talk about the verdict itself. So number 1, the reforms of the Bosporan Kingdom are, as far as I'm aware, still standard Greek reforms. They have the Thurios reforms and the Thorax reforms. Thurios occurs at Imperium level 3 for your faction once you hit turn 50, and the Thorax reforms become available once you hit Imperium level 5 and you hit turn 120. That could change in the future, and in fact I would expect it to. but so far I haven't received any information stating otherwise. And then the next thing, of course, is that your navy. Your navy, while it's not terrible, it's not all that massive, so I'm not going to cover it in this video, but basically you have a bunch of marine ships that you can rely on, and the marines are the exact same statistically wise, except that they are on different ships, and each ship has a different amount of men on it. That's the only difference between your melee ships. And your missile ships, you only have 2 archers and 1 siege unit, so besides that, your navy is pretty standard, just not very good and not worth talking about a lot in this video in my opinion, just to save time. You can explore that yourself because there's nothing really secretive to let you know about that. Alrighty, so what is the verdict for the Bosporan Kingdom? Well, your early game should be fairly easy if you expand west or if you expand south. Expanding east into the massive and desolate Scythian lands is a bad idea in my opinion, and I don't recommend you do it until you're ready. You can easily get drawn into an early war against the Scythians, and they can get to your cities before your army can fall back and protect them. So be careful, they might try to just run around you because their territory is so vast. So, additionally, my next point is that you need to ally with the Eastern Scythians. You don't necessarily have to get a military alliance, but getting trade, getting non-aggression, that's how you start cozying them up to being happy with your position and being their western neighbor. Eventually, you probably will want to wipe them out, but early on, like I said, if you want to have an easy early game, get those non-aggression packs happening, get those defensive alliances when possible, and the Scythians will be a very good guard against your eastern threats to the Far East, such as Parthia and whatnot. Your mid to late game, that's where things are getting a little bit more complicated. Your severe lack of pikes is very concerning, and you don't really have any way to handle that besides trying to use all horse archer armies, which you can, but I don't recommend it. It will use up a lot of your population, and it involves basically just kiting tactics, which can get very boring very quickly, and just generally I don't recommend you try and do that unless you are really struggling against the pike heavy factions and you have no other way of getting around them. So the best way to defeat pikes besides just skirmishing them to death is using peltas, which I guess part of skirmishing, but anyway, or you surround them and have your shock infantry units or shock cavalry charge into their rear, and that is where the Thracians come in. The Thracians provide you with some amazing shock infantry. Use them to your best ability, and they will do very well against the Diadochi factions that use pikes so heavily. You can have the Thracian peltas smash the pikemen from the front or the side, and in the meantime your own fire warriors run around the rear, and they get a beautiful charge and cut them down within moments. So if you can get those good army compositions happening where you have a good amount of peltas, a good amount of shock infantry or cavalry, and a solid main battle line to hold whatever's coming your way, you will have an easier time of it, but you're still going to struggle against the main front lines of pikemen. But beyond that, I don't see you struggling too much against any other types of armies. Roman legionaries shouldn't be too much of a problem for you as long as you use a lot of cavalry or the Thracian units. Like I was saying, they will decimate Roman legionaries. That is their weakness, so try to exploit it. And you have a good amount of hoplites that you can use to hold the Roman legionaries in position for long enough. Just make sure you keep them in that phalanx ability. Additionally to that, make sure you're fighting factions like the Romans outside in the open. I would also recommend you do that for the Greek factions as well. But for the nomad Scythians, make sure you're fighting inside their cities, especially when you go up against the major eastern powers like Media and Parthia. Those guys use a lot of cavalry a lot of the time, and their cav is often better than your own, so I would recommend you try to force city battles there if and whenever you can. But considering all of these points and my earlier points when we talked about the Grand Campaign itself, overall the difficulty rating I'm giving to this faction is a 4 out of 10. It is below average in its difficulty. It's not quite easy, but it's a little bit easier than normal in my opinion. You have a lot of options regarding your military. Your only issue is that you don't have pikes and you don't have long-range slingers, which both of those aspects can be countered fairly easily if you identify them and figure out what you need to do to replace them. So in my opinion, while you might have areas where you'll struggle, A typical casual DEI player shouldn't have too much issue with this faction. You're in a perfect position to own your area of the campaign map. You don't really have any major threats close to you. Your major threats will be coming from the east once you finally expand out into the Caucasus Mountains, or when you finally go to Greece. And that's up to you if you even want to do that. You might not want to, and you might just want to stay in the barbarian lands and wipe them out very easily, which you can because your faction is better than most of the barbarians that you'll come up against. Scythians, they're weaker than you, but they do have the advantage on open territory. So in my opinion, you should still beat them fairly easily. But anyways, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for this faction overview for the Bosporan Kingdom. Make sure you leave your suggestions for the next faction overview down below, although I believe we'll be covering culture since they were overhauled as well in the 1.2.8 patch. But anyway, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I shall see you in the next one.